Thanksgiving is supposed to be about family, food, and gratitude. But for me, it turned into the night my mother disowned me in front of everyone. We were sitting around the table, plate still half full of turkey, mashed potatoes, and stuffing. The fireplace crackled in the background. Wine glasses clinked, and conversation was settling into that comfortable lull after dinner. Then my mom stood up, tapped her glass with a fork, and with a smug smile, cleared her throat. "I just want to take a moment to share something important with all of you," she said. I felt in my bones this was going to be bad. She looked straight at me, then at my older brother, Daniel. He was already smirking like he knew what was coming. Then she dropped the bombshell. "I've decided that when I pass, everything I own, my house, my savings, my investments, will go to Daniel. Everything." She paused dramatically, letting it sink in before adding, "Because you, Alex, don't deserve anything." The entire table went silent. A fork scraped against a plate. My cousin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Someone cleared their throat. I just sat there, stunned. She said it so casually, like she was announcing dessert, like it wasn't the most brutal, humiliating thing to say to your own son in front of the entire family. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, enjoying the show. I wasn't even surprised. My mom had always favored Daniel. Ever since we were kids, he was a golden child, the one who could do no wrong. He got the best gifts at Christmas, the bigger bedroom, the praise. I got whatever was left over. Still, I never thought she'd go this far. Taking a deep breath, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Are you serious?" She nodded, still smiling. "I've thought about it for a long time. You never listen to me. You always do your own thing, and you never show me the appreciation that Daniel does." I scoffed. "You mean because I don't worship the ground you walk on?" Her eyes narrowed. "Because you're ungrateful. Because you don't do anything for this family. Because you're selfish." My uncle shifted in his seat. My aunt let out a nervous chuckle, trying to break the tension. My grandmother, sitting at the far end of the table, didn't say a word. She just watched. Daniel finally spoke up. "Sounds fair to me," he said, grinning. "I mean, I am the one who's been here for Mom. You just ran off and did your own thing." I clenched my fists under the table. Yeah, I moved out. I had to, because staying meant being treated like garbage every single day. I worked my ass off to build my own life, my own career, without any help from you. Meanwhile, Daniel still lived at home. He was 38 years old, unemployed, and had never paid a bill in his life. And now he was getting everything. Or so he thought. Just as Daniel was basking in his little victory, my grandmother, my mom's own mother, cleared her throat. Every head at the table turned toward her. She was 94 years old, but she still had the sharpest mind of anyone I knew. A man stood just behind her chair, holding a briefcase. I hadn't noticed him before because he had been sitting quietly in the corner. The lawyer. My mom's smile vanished. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharper. My grandmother placed her hand on the table. "You don't own this house, Margaret. You never did." A stunned silence fell over the room. I frowned, looking between my grandmother and my mother. "What do you mean she doesn't own the house?" Grandma exhaled like she had been waiting for this moment for years. Then she nodded to the lawyer, who stepped forward and pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase. "Because," Grandma said, her voice unwavering, "this house and everything else you're trying to give away was never yours to give." My mother's face drained of color. Daniel sat up suddenly, looking very nervous. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "As per the original agreement signed in 1976, he said, flipping to the papers, "this property, along with all financial assets in question, were put into an irrevocable trust." My mom froze. Daniel's smirk disappeared. "Eh, what?" he snapped. The lawyer turned a page, ignoring him. "An irrevocable trust," he repeated, "which means the terms of ownership cannot be changed." Then he looked up at my mother. "Margaret, you have never legally owned this house. Your mother does. And per the trust conditions, she decides who inherits it." I swear you could hear a pin drop. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, My mother sat perfectly still, like she had just been slapped across the face. And then, for the first time that night, my grandmother smiled. "And I have already made my decision," she said. The room felt heavy. No one spoke. My mother sat there stiff as a board, her face completely blank. Daniel, who had been grinning like a fool just moments ago, now looked like someone had knocked the air out of him. The lawyer cleared his throat again, flipping through the papers. As per the conditions of the trust, the designated heir of this property and all associated assets is... He looked straight at me. "Alex." I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it was so ridiculous, so completely unbelievable that I thought maybe I had misheard. "What?" my mother snapped. Daniel shot out of his chair. No, that's not possible. This is my house." The lawyer didn't even flinch. He just adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly. "Actually, no. As I was explaining, this house was placed into an irrevocable trust by your grandfather. It was never legally transferred to Margaret. Upon his passing, full control was given to your grandmother, with explicit instructions for how the estate would be passed down." Daniel was fuming. "This is some kind of joke." My mother regained her voice. "I have taken care of this house. I have raised my children here." My grandmother slowly turned her head to look at her. "Oh, is that what you think?" Her voice had an edge to it, something I had never heard before. "Margaret, you never paid a single dime for this house. Your father and I did. We let you live here because we thought you would treat this house with respect. But do you know what we found out?" She leaned forward, resting her wrinkled hands on the table. "You took out loans against it." My stomach dropped. A few people at the table gasped. My mother flinched as if she had been physically struck. "That's not true," she spat. I don't know what you're talking about." The lawyer turned a page and read aloud. "Over the past 15 years, you have taken out multiple lines of credit using this property as collateral under the assumption that you were the rightful owner. These loans totaled over $250,000. No." My mother slammed her hands on the table. "That's a lie." The lawyer didn't even blink. He kept reading. "You defaulted on several of these loans, resulting in liens being placed on the house. Your most recent attempt was just last year when you tried to secure an additional $50,000, which was denied because the property does not legally belong to you." The color drained completely from my mother's face. She looked at Daniel, desperate. "Daniel, say something." But Daniel, he looked like he was about to be sick. I had never seen him like that before. Like he was actually scared. "Mom, is this true?" She didn't answer. My grandmother sighed heavily and sat back. "You lied to your own son. You let him believe that everything was his. And meanwhile, you would try to suck this house dry for every last penny." She shook her head, her voice cold. "Disgusting." I was still trying to wrap my head around everything when Daniel suddenly snapped. "This isn't fair," he shouted. "I've done everything for you, Mom. I stayed here. I took care of you. And now you're telling me that I get nothing?" The lawyer looked at him. "Not exactly." Daniel blinked. "What?" The lawyer flipped to the final page and slid a document across the table. "Your grandmother has decided to give you a choice." Daniel snatched the paper and skimmed it, his face twisted in rage. "This is a joke." I glanced at it, and when I saw what was written, I nearly choked. "What is it?" I asked. My grandmother folded her hands. "I am offering Daniel a one-time payout of $50,000 on the condition that he immediately moves out of the house and never contacts me again." The room was dead silent. Daniel looked like he had been punched in the gut. "You're kicking me out?" Grandma didn't blink. "Yes." My mother gasped. "You can't do that." "I can." My grandmother was completely calm. "You thought you were in control, Margaret. You thought you could cut Alex out and hand everything to Daniel. But the truth is, this was never yours to give. You've been living in my house under my generosity. And now, that generosity is over." Daniel turned to my mother, his voice almost pleading. "Mom, say something. Don't let her do this." But my mother She was frozen. I could see it in her eyes. The realization was finally hitting her. She had lost. Her entire plan had just crumbled in front of her. Daniel turned back to the lawyer. "I'm not leaving. You can't make me." The lawyer nodded once, as if he had expected that response. "That's your decision. But if you refuse to pay out, we will be proceeding with a legal eviction." Daniel's mouth fell open. "Eviction? You can't evict me." The lawyer flipped another page. "Under state law, you're considered a tenant. You have not contributed financially to this household in over a decade. Since ownership is being officially transferred, the new owner has the right to remove you." Daniel looked at me, his eyes wild. "You wouldn't do that to me, right, Alex? We're brothers." I just stared at him. After everything he had done, after years of watching him reap the rewards while I was treated like nothing, after watching him smirk as my mother disowned me in front of everyone, I finally had the power, and I was about to use it. Daniel sat there, breathing hard, gripping the contract so tightly his knuckles turned white. My mother was still frozen, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between the lawyer, my grandmother, and me, like she was trying to figure out a way to undo what had just happened. I could see it in her face. She never expected this. She thought this dinner would be her grand moment, where she'd humiliate me, cut me out, and watch as Daniel basked in victory. Instead, she had just learned that she had never been in control at all. Daniel shoved his chair back, standing so fast his plate rattled. This is actual." "No," my grandmother said calmly. "This is justice." Daniel turned to me, his face red with fury. "This isn't fair, Alex. You don't even want this house. I've been here my whole life." I leaned back in my chair, finally feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. That's funny. You didn't seem too worried about fairness when Mom was trying to cut me out. Daniel's nostrils flared. "This is different." "No, Daniel, it isn't." I had spent years watching him get handed everything. I had spent years listening to my mother praise him while treating me like an outsider. And now it was my turn. The lawyer slid another document across the table. "You have 30 days to leave, Daniel. If you don't, we'll begin the formal eviction process." Daniel snatched the paper off the table and crumpled it in his fist. "I'm not going anywhere." Silence. And then my grandmother chuckled. "Oh, Daniel, you always did think you could stomp your feet and get your way." She picked up her teacup and took a slow, deliberate sip. "But you forget I know everything." Daniel froze. And then she said the words that changed everything. "I know about the second mortgage.